Millions of people along one of the most densely populated stretches of coastline on Earth just woke up to a forecast that meteorologists don't issue lightly. From the mid-Atlantic up through New England, forecasting agencies have flagged the next 10 days as a period of heightened, compounding risk, the kind of language that usually only shows up when multiple weather systems are lining up to interact rather than pass through one at a time. This isn't a single storm warning. It's something meteorologists find far more unsettling to forecast and far more dangerous to live through. A stacked sequence where the ground, the rivers, and the coastline don't get a chance to recover between one system and the next. To understand why forecasters are treating this window differently than a normal 10-day outlook, you have to understand what's actually driving it. Deep in the upper atmosphere, a persistent dip in the jet stream has locked itself over the eastern half of the country, essentially acting like a channel that keeps steering one weather system after another along nearly the same track. Meteorologists call this a blocking pattern, and it's one of the most reliable ingredients for consecutive extreme weather events, because instead of storms scattering in different directions the way they normally would, they get funneled one after another down the same corridor, hitting the same communities, the same rivers, the same saturated ground, again and again within a short window. The first system in this sequence is already drawing moisture up from unusually warm ocean water off the southeast coast. Warm water that's been sitting well above seasonal averages for weeks. Warmer ocean surface temperatures don't just make storms wetter, they make them more efficient at pulling that moisture upward and dumping it as rain, because warm water evaporates faster and warm air holds more water vapor before it's forced to release it. Forecast models are already showing rainfall totals for the opening system alone that would qualify as a significant flood risk on their own before anything else arrives behind it. That's the part meteorologists keep emphasizing, because it's the detail most people miss when they see a 10-day forecast full of rain icons and assume it just means an inconvenient, soggy stretch. The danger here isn't really about any single system's intensity. It's about sequencing. When one heavy rain event hits ground that's already dry, most of that water gets absorbed, slowed down, buffered by soil that has room to take it in. But when a second, and potentially a third, system arrives on top of ground that's already saturated from the system before it, that buffer disappears entirely. Water that would normally soak in instead runs straight off the surface, straight into storm drains, streams, and rivers that are already running higher than normal. Flash flooding under these compounding conditions doesn't require unusually extreme rainfall totals. It requires a landscape that has lost its ability to absorb anything more. River forecast centers along the corridor are already watching this dynamic closely. Several major river systems that drain large sections of the mid-Atlantic and Northeast are projected to rise toward action stage, the threshold at which agencies begin actively coordinating with local emergency managers well before the second system in the sequence is even forecast to arrive. If that timing holds, it means river levels could still be elevated, in some cases still actively receding from the first event, when the next pulse of rain adds to them directly, a scenario hydrologists specifically flag as high risk because it compresses what would normally be a multi-day recovery window into almost nothing. Coastal communities are watching an entirely separate but equally serious piece of this forecast: the tidal and surge component. As the pressure systems driving this pattern intensify, they're expected to coincide with a period of astronomically higher tides along parts of the coastline, driven by the moon's position in its orbital cycle rather than the weather itself. When onshore winds from an intensifying coastal storm push ocean water toward the shore at the same time the tide is already running higher than normal for purely astronomical reasons, the combined water level, what forecasters call the total water level, can climb well above what either factor would produce on its own. Coastal flood warnings under these compound conditions don't need a major hurricane to cause real damage. A persistent, moderately strong coastal storm arriving during a period of elevated tides can push seawater into streets, parking structures, and ground floor properties in low-lying communities that don't typically see flooding outside of a major named storm. Wind is the other factor forecasters are watching closely across this window, and it's connected directly back to that same blocking pattern steering everything along the same track. Sustained pressure gradients tightening between the storm systems and high pressure building in behind them are expected to produce extended periods of strong, gusty winds. Not just brief squalls passing through, but hours-long stretches capable of downing weakened trees and knocking out power across a wide area. Utility companies serving the region have already begun pre-positioning repair crews and equipment ahead of the window, a step typically reserved for storms expected to cause widespread, multi-day outages rather than routine weather. What makes this particular 10-day stretch stand out even among meteorologists used to tracking severe weather is how unusually high the confidence is this far out. 10-day forecasts, especially for exact rainfall totals and storm tracks, normally carry significant uncertainty, and forecasters are typically cautious about issuing strong warning language that far in advance. What's different here is the blocking pattern itself. Because it's locked in place rather than shifting, and because multiple independent forecast models are converging on the same general sequence rather than diverging the way they usually do at this range, agencies are more confident than usual that this isn't a low probability scenario buried in the forecast noise. It's the most likely outcome across nearly every model run they're looking at. Emergency management officials across the affected states have started issuing the kind of pre-event guidance usually reserved for storms with a clearer, single-event timeline, clearing storm drains before the first system arrives, securing loose outdoor furniture and debris that could become wind-driven projectiles, reviewing evacuation routes in flood-prone neighborhoods, and specifically warning residents against a pattern officials say causes more deaths during multi-day flood events than almost anything else, driving through flooded roadways. Water levels on familiar roads can look deceptively shallow and change within minutes as upstream rainfall arrives, and vehicles are far easier to sweep off a roadway in moving water than most drivers assume, a warning that becomes especially critical when flooding isn't a single event but a repeating pattern over 10 days rather than a single afternoon. There's also a strain on resources dimension to this forecast that officials are being unusually direct about. Emergency response systems, from local fire and rescue units to state-level flood response teams, are built with the expectation that a storm event happens, causes damage, and then crews have time to respond, recover, and reset before the next major weather event arrives. A compounding, multi-system pattern compresses that recovery window, potentially forcing agencies to respond to a second or third flooding event while crews and resources are still actively engaged with the first. Several states along the corridor have already reached out to neighboring states through mutual aid agreements to pre-position additional water rescue teams and equipment specifically because of this compressed timeline. For residents across the affected region, the practical takeaway forecasters keep repeating is less about any single day on the 10-day outlook and more about the cumulative picture. A single afternoon of heavy rain within this window might not look dramatic in isolation. It's the accumulation across the full stretch, system after system, landing on ground and rivers that never get a real chance to recover, that officials say represents the genuine threat. That's also why this warning window doesn't come with a single dramatic peak day the way a hurricane forecast might. It comes with a sustained caution covering the better part of 2 weeks, precisely because the danger builds cumulatively rather than arriving all at once. Forecasters are continuing to update model guidance daily as the pattern evolves, watching closely for any sign the blocking pattern weakens or shifts track, which would ease the sequencing risk considerably. As of the latest guidance, though, that shift hasn't shown up in the data, and agencies across the region are treating the coming 10 days as an extended, active watch period rather than a series of isolated forecasts to check individually. For a stretch of coastline home to some of the most densely populated cities in the country, that shift in tone, from routine forecasting language to sustained, compounding risk warnings, is itself the clearest signal of how seriously meteorologists are taking what's about to unfold. Beyond the immediate operational response, there's a broader pattern researchers who study extreme weather sequencing have been tracking for several years now, and this event fits squarely inside it. Blocking patterns that lock storm tracks in place for extended periods aren't new, but data going back several decades shows they've been trending toward lasting longer and occurring more frequently along the exact stretch of coastline currently under watch. That's part of why emergency planners in the region have spent recent seasons updating their response protocols specifically around multi-system compound events rather than single storms, treating this kind of stacked sequence less as an outlier and more as a scenario they now need standing plans for. Coastal engineers designing storm drain capacity, floodplain maps, and levee systems have historically built around the assumption of isolated events with recovery time in between, an assumption that compound sequences like this one are increasingly putting under pressure. Hydrologists watching the river gauges are also paying close attention to something called antecedent soil moisture, essentially how wet the ground already was before this pattern even began. Weeks of near normal to slightly above normal rainfall heading into this window means many of the region's watersheds were already running with less absorptive capacity than they'd have in a drier stretch, which is part of why forecasters are confident flooding could begin earlier in the sequence than the rainfall totals alone might suggest. It's the same reason two storms carrying similar rainfall totals can produce dramatically different flood outcomes depending entirely on what the ground looked like before the first raindrop fell. For coastal city planners, this event is also expected to feed directly into ongoing conversations about long-term resilience investment, seawalls, upgraded drainage systems, and elevated infrastructure in the lowest-lying neighborhoods. Every compound flooding event that pushes water into streets and basements that historically stayed dry outside of named storms adds another data point to arguments already underway in city budget meetings about how much of that infrastructure needs to be modernized and how quickly. Whether or not this specific 10-day window produces the worst-case outcome currently modeled, officials say the pattern itself, the blocking, the sequencing, the compound tidal and rainfall risk, is exactly the kind of scenario coastal infrastructure built decades ago was never designed to absorb. There's a historical comparison meteorologists keep bringing up when explaining why this pattern worries them more than an isolated storm would, and it's worth understanding because it shapes exactly what emergency planners are preparing for. Some of the most damaging flood events in the region's history weren't caused by any single record-breaking storm. They were caused by exactly this kind of sequencing, multiple moderate systems arriving close together, each one unremarkable on its own, but devastating in combination because the ground and rivers never reset between them. Communities that can absorb a single major storm without serious damage have, in past compound events, ended up with far worse outcomes than a stronger, isolated storm would have produced, purely because of timing. That historical pattern is exactly why forecasters are choosing their language carefully this time, avoiding comparisons to any single dramatic storm and instead framing the entire 10-day window itself as the hazard. Airlines and transportation authorities across the corridor are also factoring this forecast into operational planning well ahead of the first system's arrival. Extended periods of low-level wind shear and reduced visibility associated with a locked-in blocking pattern tend to produce cascading delays across major hub airports, delays that can ripple through the national flight network far beyond the storm-affected region itself, since so much of the country's air traffic routes through East Coast hubs. Rail operators serving flood-prone, low-lying track sections have similarly begun reviewing contingency schedules, aware that even moderate flooding on certain corridor segments has historically forced service suspensions lasting well beyond the rain event itself while inspection and cleanup crews clear the tracks. Public health officials are watching a slower-moving but equally serious consequence of extended flooding: the risk of waterborne contamination in areas where floodwater mixes with aging stormwater and sewage infrastructure. Many older coastal cities in the region still rely on combined sewer systems, where stormwater and wastewater share the same pipes, and periods of sustained heavy rainfall can overwhelm that capacity, forcing untreated overflow directly into streets, waterways, and in some cases residential areas. Health departments have already begun preparing standard advisories around avoiding contact with standing floodwater, a precaution that becomes considerably more relevant across a 10-day event with multiple flooding pulses than it would during a single afternoon storm. Local news outlets and community organizations across the affected states have started amplifying preparation guidance well ahead of the first system, encouraging residents in flood-prone areas to review insurance coverage, since standard homeowners' policies typically exclude flood damage and require separate flood insurance that can take up to 30 days to take effect after purchase, meaning residents, who don't already have coverage in place, have effectively missed the window to add it before this specific event. That detail alone has driven a noticeable spike in flood insurance inquiries across the region in the days since the warning was issued, even though agents are having to explain to many callers that new policies won't apply in time for this particular sequence. What ties all of these threads together, the transportation disruptions, the public health advisories, the insurance scramble, the mutual aid prepositioning, is the same underlying reality forecasters have been emphasizing since this pattern first became clear in the models. This isn't a single, containable event with a defined beginning and end. It's a sustained hazard window, and every system built around the assumption of isolated storms with recovery time in between, from stormwater infrastructure to emergency response staffing to individual household preparedness, is being tested simultaneously by the same underlying pattern. Whether the coming 10 days ultimately produce the worst-case outcome currently reflected in the models or something more moderate, meteorologists say the compounding structure of the risk itself is the story, and it's one they'll be watching, system by system, day by day, until the blocking pattern finally breaks.